Welcome to the online version of CAP's Anxiety Toolbox Brief Treatment Group. While you will not have the same experience as taking part in the brief treatment group, you will receive the same information to help you build tools to better cope and manage your anxiety. Because the onset and causes of anxiety can vary from person to person, this program will not focus on identifying the cause for your individual experiences. Instead, we will focus on increasing your general understanding of anxiety symptoms and on building tools to better cope with anxiety. Let's start with a brief summary about what the Anxiety Toolbox is and what you can expect from this program. The Anxiety Toolbox is delivered in 3 parts, with content that builds upon itself. The presentations are meant to be viewed in order. All the information covered in the presentation, as well as worksheets and supporting materials, can be found in the accompanying workbook. In Part 1, we will take a broad look at 4 symptom clusters of anxiety and introduce a method for slowing down and disentangling the experience of anxiety. In Part 2, we focus on increasing insight on the thought patterns that impact your anxiety. Increasing awareness and understanding are major tools in addressing anxiety. Finally, in Part 3, we develop alternative responses to anxiety, and you'll create a personalized action plan for managing anxiety. In order to build these coping skills, regular practice is essential. The more you practice, the more you're going to get out of this program. There are exercises and between-session assignments for you to practice. We recommend that you take a day or 2 between each presentation in order to practice the new skills you will learn. Let's review the topics I'll be presenting today. First, I'll talk about the difference between stress and anxiety and how stress can actually be good for you. Next, I'll explain the nature of anxiety and why it affects us physically. Then we'll look at 4 clusters of anxiety symptoms and how they interact. We'll finish today's program by practicing a breathing exercise that can help manage your anxiety symptoms. Let's start. Let's begin by talking about what stress and anxiety are. Oftentimes, we use the terms stress and anxiety interchangeably, but they're actually different when it comes to diagnosable anxiety disorders. I'll refer to diagnosable anxiety disorders as clinical anxiety. Clinical anxiety and everyday anxiety, or stress, often look similar and share the same arousal response. Arousal basically means being alert physically and mentally. Both stress and anxiety trigger people to become more alert. They also share many of the same symptoms. Let's take a moment to distinguish between the two. Stress, or everyday anxiety, is a response to a known environmental factor or stressor. In the life of a student, this could be an upcoming test or a difficult homework assignment. Symptoms usually go away when the stressor goes away. You've probably noticed a decrease in feelings of stress when you've caught up on your academic tasks or during the weekend when you aren't attending class. Stress and everyday anxiety is something we all experience at some point in our lives. That's why we talk about managing or coping with stress and anxiety, not eliminating it. It's a part of life, and it can actually be motivational. How many times have you waited to start writing that paper until you feel some internal pressure to get it done? That's a type of stress that is helpful in accomplishing tasks. Sometimes a stressor can be ongoing, chronic, overwhelming, or disruptive to your everyday functioning. More severe symptoms, usually associated with anxiety disorders. It's important to understand that you can experience some severe symptoms of anxiety, but not have an anxiety disorder. More severe anxiety can occur with chronic stress, when you experience a major stressful event such as a loss or a series of setbacks. Anxiety can also occur when there is no identifiable stressor. Anxiety differs from stress in a number of ways. Unlike stress, anxiety symptoms will persist even after the stressor has passed. Symptom intensity is also exaggerated compared to what one would expect given the situation. Unlike stress, anxiety is not motivational, and is perpetuated by avoidance, which I'll talk more about later. The general way to understand the difference between stress and anxiety is that anxiety results in significant distress and disruption that causes significant distress and interferes with your daily life. For example, most people experience some stress when they sit down to take a test, but if you can't focus on the test questions, or you can't even complete a test because of your anxious feelings, then you may be experiencing clinical anxiety. Anxiety ranges in severity from everyday anxiety and stress to a diagnosable anxiety disorder. For a list of the differences between stress and clinical anxiety, and for more information about various anxiety disorders, please check out the appendices in your workbook. I mentioned earlier that one of the main differences between stress and clinical anxiety is that sometimes stress is helpful. I want to highlight this point about stress or everyday anxiety as a motivator and high levels of anxiety as a hindrance to performance. The idea here is that when you experience no stress or anxiety, in other words, no sense of mental or physical arousal, you have little motivation to keep up with your normal responsibilities. And the reverse is true. If you have too much anxiety or arousal, you may attempt to avoid the situation or perform poorly due to the symptoms associated with high levels of stress and anxiety. However, with a moderate level of arousal from stress or anxiety, you are likely to become motivated to prepare, concentrate, or do whatever is necessary for the situation without becoming debilitated or avoidant. This concept is illustrated in the stress curve diagram. On the left side of the curve, you see a green area that corresponds to too little stress and thereby little motivation. You may be feeling laid back or experiencing no sense of urgency to prompt you to action. As your stress increases, you'll enter the yellow zone in the curve. This illustrates an optimum level of stress where you are experiencing a suitable level of arousal, mental and physical alertness, that acts as a motivator to engage and participate. If, however, your stress levels continue to build, you'll reach the middle of the curve, and things will start to go downhill. As you experience too much stress, you'll begin experiencing symptoms of anxiety that inhibit or impede performance and can lead to high anxiety, panic, and powerful negative emotions. Let's consider an example. Say you have an upcoming test. If you are experiencing minimal or no stress, you may say to yourself, "Why bother studying?" and decide you can just wing it, which could be a risky strategy. With too much anxiety, you may feel overwhelmed and hopeless, so you also avoid studying. Similarly, when taking the test, too little stress can result in a lack of focus and effort, whereas too much stress can hamper focus, make it difficult to recall information, or leave you fixated on a particular problem until time runs out. Clearly, a better strategy would be to manage stress and anxiety so that you have enough stress to feel motivated or energized to study or take the test. These are the types of strategies you will learn and tools you will build in this program. Before we start on the basics of building cognitive tools, there are a couple of more topics about anxiety that I would like to talk about. Let's talk about avoidance, which is a common response to feelings of anxiety. This diagram helps visualize how avoidance relates to anxiety. Let's call it the anxiety avoidance roller coaster. Often, when people have an anxiety-provoking situation, they experience numerous uncomfortable physical, emotional, and cognitive symptoms. To avoid the uncomfortable experience of anxiety, people avoid the anxiety-provoking situation altogether. For example, some people who start watching this video may have already stopped watching to avoid the feelings that even talking about anxiety can provoke. Initially, the avoidance brings a sense of relief. However, every time we avoid an anxiety-producing situation, our anxiety is actually reinforced. The brain sees it like this. When I avoid this situation, I feel better, or at least nothing bad happened. I guess I should try to avoid it the next time too. The avoidance anxiety roller coaster repeats. Sound familiar? But the short-term relief of avoidance and escape comes at a high cost. Avoidance and escape contributes to the persistence of anxiety and reduces a person's level of daily functioning. This is why exposure, or doing things that you typically avoid because of anxiety, is beneficial. Exposing yourself to the anxiety-provoking situation helps you to see the situation more realistically and increases your tolerance for anxiety. For example, those of you who experienced anxiety about watching this presentation will likely feel less anxious about viewing the next one. So now you're probably asking, how can I increase exposure and get off the anxiety avoidance roller coaster? First, we need to understand what's going on when you experience anxiety. A big part of anxiety has to do with our physiological responses to stressors, the physical sensations we experience in our bodies. Some of you may have heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what we're talking about here. Essentially, the most primitive part of our brain, the amygdala, has an evolutionary basis in protecting us from danger. This is a good thing. Our amygdala is our body's anxiety switch. When, as early humans, we were living in the wilderness and needed protection from danger, such as animals or other predators, this part of our body adapted and switched on to help us to either fight the predator or flee from the situation. Fighting or fleeing, aka avoidance, was our brain's adaptive response to danger. Researchers later acknowledged that in addition to fighting or fleeing, we may also respond by freezing when we perceive danger. It's not as commonly discussed, but it's also an adaptive response. The freeze response is more of an automatic shutdown in functioning, like a deer caught in headlights. Let's think about it like this. If you were hiking, confronted by a dangerous animal, and the amygdala, the anxiety switch, switched on, what might you feel happening in your body? In your workbook, there is a diagram labeled Threat System. Take a moment and put a check mark next to any physical symptoms you may have experienced in an anxious situation. You can pause the video here while you review the symptoms, and then start again when you are ready. I'm sure many of these symptoms were familiar to you. These are the fight or flight responses triggered by our amygdala. These responses saved us from danger as early humans, and they save us from danger today. So they're very helpful and adaptive when it comes to life-threatening situations. But typically, the threats we face today, the ones that may trigger the physiological responses, are not life-threatening, right? When was the last time you had to escape from a dangerous animal? So the threats are different, but our brains react just like they did when we were early humans dealing with life-threatening situations. The fight, flight, or freeze system is getting mistriggered because our brains are not distinguishing between life-threatening and non-life-threatening stressors. It's like a false alarm that is constantly going off. Our amygdala gets stuck in the on mode, so we run away from or we fight danger all day long and we tire ourselves out. Further, the amygdala learns that this level of arousal and anxiety, this constant on mode, is the new norm, and the amygdala adopts this new elevated level of anxiety for your body. This may be why you feel anxious all the time. So the fight, flight, or freeze response, triggered by the amygdala, contributes to physiological symptoms of anxiety. These physiological symptoms are one of the uncomfortable things that we avoid when we avoid anxiety-provoking situations. Now that you have a better understanding of what happens in your body when you're anxious, let's get a broader picture that will be the basis for building tools to manage and cope with anxiety. To build the tools to cope and manage anxiety, we will be drawing from a therapy called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, or CBT. This is a model of evidence-based therapy in treating anxiety that focuses on interactions between symptoms in three main areas: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. However, when we talk about anxiety, we add physiological or physical symptoms to this model because, as I just explained and you likely already know, physical sensations are a major part of the anxiety experience. So in this program, we'll focus on 4 symptom clusters: physical, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive responses. In your workbook, you will find a visual representation of this model in the form of the cross-sectional diagram. The CBT model is a fundamental part of your anxiety toolbox, and this diagram is the basis for developing tools to better cope and reduce your stress and anxiety. Let's take a look at an example of how to use this tool. At the top of the page is a box labeled Situation. This is where you would write in a situation or event that makes you feel anxious. In this example, the situation is being invited to a party by a student in your residence hall that you don't know well. The next box on the diagram is where you would fill in the physical sensations that correspond to the anxiety-provoking situation. In this example, a racing heart, constricted chest, shallow breathing, and feeling hot. The feelings that are coming up for you in this situation go in the next box. In this example, the person is feeling a lot of mixed emotions, including fear, shame, loneliness, agitation, and nervousness. The box across is for cognitive responses, the thoughts going through your mind in response to the situation or event. In this example, these are thoughts about feeling awkward, not having any fun, and not making any friends. The final box in the diagram is for behaviors, the things you do or don't do in response to the anxiety-provoking situation. The person in this example avoided potential bad feelings by not going to the party. Now take a moment to notice the lines connecting these 4 symptom clusters. The arrows show you not only how every component in the diagram is connected, but also indicate how they influence each other. One of the helpful aspects of this diagram is how it takes the whole big wound up together ball of an anxiety experience and breaks it into smaller pieces. Pulling apart the anxiety experience, identifying what you are thinking, doing, and feeling emotionally and physically will help you to develop the specific tools that are right for you. Before completing your own personal cross-sectional formulation, it is important to acknowledge that this activity, thinking about and writing down your anxiety symptoms, may increase your current levels of anxiety. Even thinking about this activity may increase your anxiety. That is totally normal, especially if you are accustomed to avoiding thinking about it. Just know that as we spend time talking about anxiety in a constructive manner, the intensity of the anxious feelings will most likely begin to decrease. And at the same time, we will be practicing new tools to manage your anxiety. Now is a good time for you to pause to practice using this tool. Using one of the blank diagrams in your workbook, take a minute to think about a situation where you felt anxious, and then jot down the corresponding symptoms you experienced. If you're having trouble thinking of symptoms, there are symptoms listed in the pages after the blank diagram to assist you. This is another good time to pause the video, practice with this tool, and then start the video when you are ready. I hope you took some time to practice with the cross-sectional formulation. We'll be revisiting this tool in the next module of this program. So we may have just increased our anxiety symptoms by actively focusing on an anxiety-provoking situation instead of avoiding it. Let's learn a new skill for our anxiety toolbox. One of the most effective coping strategies you can use for anxiety symptoms, particularly the physical ones, is deep breathing and relaxation. Remember how we talked about the fight, flight, or freeze response? This response activates your sympathetic nervous system. It sends oxygen to your arms and legs so that you are prepared to fight or flee. Less oxygen is sent to our thinking brain in our prefrontal cortex, which makes it difficult to think clearly. Deep breathing and relaxation activate the other part of your nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which sends a signal to your brain to tell the anxious part that you're safe and you don't need to use the fight, flight, or freeze response. Deep breathing gets more oxygen to the thinking brain, and by addressing the physical fight, flight, and freeze symptoms directly, you are freeing up mental energy to address other symptoms. Before we practice the deep breathing, let's take a moment to check in on your anxiety level. This is like taking a thermometer reading of anxiety. You're going to rate your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very low to non-existent, and 10 being the most severe anxiety you've ever experienced. Make a mental note of your thermometer reading now. Okay, let's learn a new deep breathing skill. Sometimes this is called balloon breathing because you're going to fill up your belly like a big balloon full of air. I know it sounds simple, but it actually takes some concentration. I'll explain it first, and then you can give it a try. Place one hand on your stomach and the other on your chest. You want to feel the hand on your stomach move in and out more than the hand on your chest. Take a deep breath in through your nose, and as you inhale, count in your mind 1, 2, 3, 4. Imagine using the air to push against your hand on your stomach. Hold for a count of 2. Then you'll exhale through your mouth like blowing out a candle. Exhale for a count of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then pause before starting again. Okay, let's give it a try. Breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 2, and then breathe out for a count of 4, pushing the air from your mouth. Try it again, breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 2, and breathing out for a count of 4. Now take a moment to practice on your own. Now let's take a new thermometer reading. Please rate your current level of anxiety on the scale from 1 being very low to none to 10 being most severe. Did you notice a shift in your number? I encourage you to keep practicing this simple yet powerful tool. This is something you can continue to practice anywhere since it is quiet and we always need to breathe. Thanks for taking part in the first session of the Anxiety Toolbox. Today was about increasing your understanding and slowing down and disentangling the anxiety process. In this first session, we talked about the difference between stress and anxiety, learned that anxiety can be motivational, discussed the anxiety avoidance roller coaster and the value of exposure, talked about fight, flight, and freeze and our physical responses to anxiety, discussed the CBT model for understanding how anxiety works, practiced deep breathing as one tool for managing our anxiety, and learned how to complete a cross-sectional formulation for disentangling the anxiety experience. The cross-sectional formulation is an important tool for managing anxiety. Using this tool will help you to better understand and manage your anxiety experience. In the next session, we're going to talk more about the CBT model. In particular, we'll focus on identifying and managing anxious thoughts. Your independent practice between now and next session is to complete one cross-sectional formulation. This is an opportunity to practice exposure. If you feel up to it, choose an activity that you typically avoid. Otherwise, use a situation you experience over the next week or something that happens to you often. Try to complete the worksheet as soon as possible after the event. If you're unable to do so, just jot down some notes on your phone or a piece of paper that you can review later to prompt yourself to remember what happened. There are multiple blank copies in the workbook. Feel free to do more than one. Try at least one per day. That might sound a little overwhelming, but the more you practice, the better you will be at using your tools. Also, remember to practice deep breathing in your daily life. The deep breathing practice is helpful not only when you're feeling anxious, but it's helpful in maintaining a calm, clear mind. Take care.